So thinking about war, like as a Christian, is that something that we should pursue?
Somebody committed something unjust that led to that war.
Yeah.
So I think there are reasons to fight them, but I also think that you need to make sure that you're on the justified side of it.
Well, I was thinking about, it made me think about, specifically made me think about Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
When people were asking him about whether God was on his side or not. And I think he famously said he just hopes that he was on God's side or something like that.
Let's be on God's side.
Yeah. Whatever
and you think about Stonewall Jackson and all the prayers that he said, that he's doing the will of the Lord either way.
Yeah. So it's such a it's a sticky topic because we wage war against one another. Nations wage war. People groups wage war against one another. Sometimes not by your own design or your own intent. We sort of get pulled into World War II, for instance, in the U.S.
Right.
We're sort of trying to.
Some of us are.
Some of us are trying to step. But if you think about it from a leadership standpoint, right? If you believe that leaders are in place because God allows them to be in place.
Doesn't carry the sword by accident.
Exactly. And Paul, Romans 13, right? They don't carry the sword by accident, and we're supposed to, respect what our leaders say, and be led by them, essentially. But what does that mean? There's a difference, I think, between political decisions and maybe decisions as an individual Christian too.
Well, and then you've also got to look at something like the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a just war? I mean, Scripture says a rebellion is as an act of witchcraft.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, did the Americans that revolted have the right to do so?
Yeah.
I think they did.
But yeah, if it's as an act of witchcraft, that was the beginning of the Satanic Panic, then, right?
There it is.
It was already there. Yeah. It's again this. It's such a squishy border to what's good or not. I was thinking about the actual theological concept of just war,
right?
And it's supposed to have a particular motivation, and that motivation is in love,
right?
As you go to war out of love.
Oddly enough, I think Jefferson distilled some things in the Declaration of Independence that the idea of government being instituted to protect the rights of the people.
Yeah.
I think there's a loving aspect to that. And I think the fact that Britain was denying those things was an unloving thing.
But Jefferson also, he says some fairly snarky things about the king, right?
No doubt.
There's a whole litany of things like he has, and then he goes on. He has, and then goes on.
They couldn't rightly blame Parliament because they want to be just like Parliament.
Exactly. So, but again, so you have to think about that. Then the motivation, what is it really?
Right.
And we know it's independence.
Political freedom.
It's political freedom, right? Political freedom from someone who's so far away from the things that they can't really govern it in the way that it needs to be governed.
It's not adequate.
Yeah, it's not adequate. It takes too long to get information back and forth.
In some ways detrimental.
Yeah.
Right.
By the time you figure out that there's a problem, how long is it going to take to get the information back? I mean, it's a different world today.
Right.
If those events would have started today with the kind of technology that we have, it probably wouldn't have been an issue at all.
I ask this question of students a lot. Is there a way we could have avoided it? Could we have done something different? And the answer to that's always yes.
Mm-hmm.
But we did try those things.
Yeah.
And when somebody ceases to listen, you got to be on the side of the right to continue forward.
I feel like no matter what war it is, there's somebody who says we could have done this, and somebody that says
that's right.
We could have done this other thing, and that's probably always going to be true though, because we're people, we're fallible.
But I think we have examples in American history of both kinds.
Yeah.
I think there's some that we're involved in that were unjust.
Yeah.
Whereas there's some that we're involved in we're clearly on the side of the right.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm thinking, if you start a war as being motivated out of love, I think specifically it points me back into World War II, right? With what happens with Germany and what's happening with these camps, with the Jewish people and other Christians and the people that are dying.
The only hiccup in that is our actions regarding those things are not very strong.
They're not.
Because we had opportunities to save people and we didn't. I do think if you're looking for the poster boy for just war, World War II is it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we handled all of it just.
Oh, I didn't say that. I just mean, if you're looking at the forest rather than the trees in that, because we're trying to, there's this evil out there, even though at the same time, as you just said, a lot of what Hitler learned, some of it he got from us, from the United States.
No doubt.
He looked at Supreme Court decisions, specifically about eugenics,
right,
and the way that things would work out.
That was definitely started here. Yeah, a lot of the sterilization.
Sure, the sterilization. I can't remember the name of the case now, nor can I remember the name of the Supreme Court justice. But he said there was a particular case in which these two were trying to get married. And he denied marriage rights in this case because one of them was what he called incompetent, feeble-minded. Yeah, and he says specifically that their parents were and their grandparents were, and he said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And stop that, and you can't get married, you can't have children. And that was a U.S. Supreme Court decision. And so that's late 1800s, right? And all of that is sort of feeding into the mind of, can we fix society? Right. Again, this is before World War I or World War II, right? So can we fix society in a way that would, make all the problems go away? Because people thought maybe we could. And so that was in the era at that moment. It wasn't an idea of fear. It was about progress.
Right.
You had, progressive Democrats and progressive Republicans at the time, people who were making decisions about protecting national parks and setting aside land and what we need to do to safeguard the future and how do we lift everyone up. And those weren't really Democrat or Republican. They were sort of being held by both parties in that progressive wing.
And for the most part, most of the goals of the progressive movement are good.
Yeah.
They are just in a manner of speaking, but you do run into some things like eugenics, euthanasia, things like that clearly cross a moral line. And you're going to look at the same thing with Nazism or even fascism.
Yeah.
Because
they're trying to solve a real problem.
They are. And
right, Germany is especially World War II.
They were mistreated at Versailles, and what are you going to do?
That's right.
You
lose the war, and it gets dictated to you the way that things are going to be, and you get in such an economic problem that your people are suffering.
But ironically, Hitler needed a scapegoat, and to use a Jewish expression, if you will, a scapegoat. He uses the Jews as the scapegoat for Germany to get back on top. And so, in a sense, it could have been another group. It didn't have to be them.
Right.
He just played on stereotypes and stigmas that were already there.
Yeah.
He's
doing stuff that basically 20 to 30 years before were really prominent ideas in the U.S.
Right.
And they hadn't gone away at that time either by World War II. In fact, there were lots of people that sort of agreed with.
Anti-Semitism was here as well.
That's right. Not just anti-Semitism, but I'm thinking also about eugenics ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that was still a present thought, not as much as it was before.
Right.
Because World War I interrupted some things, and it began to see some atrocities in the world, and things had begun to shift. Right. So we are sort of coming out of it, even though there was we still had a toe in the water, I guess.
Right.
We're getting out, but there's still a toe in the water, and now it's Germany's turn to dive full on into that, and it was sort of the perfect storm for Hitler to rise to power, for Nazism to become the chief commitment of the land,
Right.
essentially. And they were, I think, the goals, or essentially, from their point of view, at least, were noble.
Right.
And if these others aren't actually people in the same way that we are, or they're lesser in some way, why would we want to continue that in the world? Because they're just suffering and they don't even know they're suffering.
Yeah.
And we can end suffering. And that was sort of present in what they were saying, and their reasoning for war. I think their reasoning is very wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Well, and then the method of ending suffering, if you study the way that progressed, it eventually got to a point where it's sort of institutionalized and that. But when it first starts out, German soldiers on the Eastern Front were shooting people.
Yeah.
And completely unjust. There's no way that could ever be justified. In their brains, obviously, but not when you look at it from a moral standpoint on the outside.
So if they're thinking this is a path, this path to war, from their view, was a good one, was a noble one in that sense.
They were thinking that.
They were,
yeah.
But they didn't. It wasn't motivated out of love.
No,
It's
a sense of nationalism, which went beyond what nationalism really is. Even
well, and that bleeds over into stuff that's happening today with Christian nationalism. We're sort of combining some things that I'm not so sure need to be combined in that way.
You can't blindly support one against the other.
Right.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, we have. That's what happened then, and I think people not looking back at history, they don't see these issues, and so. If you support a political candidate or a party, or a movement, and you can't criticize that movement, that's not allowed.
Yeah,
that's a red flag.
That's a problem.
That's a red flag, right? It's okay if you support somebody and say, "Well, I wish they wouldn't have done that." That's fine for that to be. I mean, there are no perfect leaders, right? And so we should be able to criticize even our friends. That man. I can't believe you did this thing. You shouldn't have done that.
Well, and I'm very Voltaire in my thinking on that. I may not believe what you say, but I'll defend your right to say it to the death.
Right.
So we have to have a political understanding that the freedom of speech is literally what it means. If I say something that is horribly wrong to you, I still have the right to say it.
That's right. So if we think about war in particular, what kind of motivation do you? I said it's love, but can you think of a specific thing? You talk about World War II, motivated out of love.
Use the Civil War, American Civil War, and then the Mexican-American War, which are they're back to back, right?
Yeah.
The Mexican-American War, I would say, is an unjust war. We believe we were motivated by manifest destiny to expand.
That's right.
But we trample on Mexico in the process.
That ties in almost to Christian nationalism, right?
And ironically, one of my family history things, my great-great-great-grandfather
was in that war.
Was the second to last survivor of the Mexican War.
I see.
But he refused to fight in the Civil War because he was not pro-slavery, if you will. He was on the other side of that. He voted no for Texas secession, some things like that. But the Civil War, from a Union standpoint, it's a just war because you're fighting to preserve the Union, which is loving.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the idea of being united, it's a loving concept.
Yeah, because Lincoln, from the beginning, his goal is to preserve the Union.
That's it.
Period.
That's it.
He doesn't have a goal of, okay, let's reshape politics and reshape it. No, it is preserve the Union.
Ending slavery, which everybody says the Civil War is about. And
he does that to cause
it's in the process.
It is. It's like the subplot, right? Because we're going to end slavery, but that didn't affect the northern states,
right?
Not the way that he did it,
right?
In the war, like Emancipation Proclamation, right?
Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, all of those they still had slaves,
right? So he's trying to hurt the South,
right? Take their ability to fight.
That's right. Take away their ability to fight, and you can't stay economically viable.
Well, in a way, it does encourage. It encourages the slaves to run away join the Union Army and fight back.
That's right.
And so in a way it does do that. But
again, with the stated goal of preserving the Union,
right.
that was one of the methods to preserve the Union in that war.
And I believe it was just. At the same time, I do think Lincoln broke the Constitution because he forced Maryland to stay in.
Suspending habeas corpus, all sorts of things.
There's some reckless handling there.
That's right.
A little bit. But I think he came out on the end of it in the right because of the reason he's doing it.
I mean, we could do an entire podcast just on for a year on presidents and decisions that they've made and they broke the Constitution. I mean, George Washington from the very beginning. I mean, right, the Whiskey Rebellion and using troops in that way.
Right. It was a gray area at first.
It was
sort of gave it its teeth.
It did. Yeah. So anyway, but so out of love, right? So that's an example you're saying is motivated by love. Are there others? So can you name another one that maybe was a war motivated?
Well, so the revolution
by love
is, the sense that we are trying to provide people with human rights, and that the idea that we're all created equal and need an equal playing field. It's a very loving concept.
Yeah. What to think of people as people.
Loving your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that's there. It's present in that.
Right.
So I think in a way the revolution has that overtone.
What do you think about the wars like Vietnam?
The hard part about that is we think democracy is the loving way.
Yeah.
The problem is if the people don't want it.
Yeah.
What do? You force it down their throat.
Yeah, and is that loving, right? And that's sort of, I think, ties in even to like Mideast problems overall.
Yeah, we get into that. I mean, but you got to have World War I on that.
Exactly. When you take apart the Ottoman Empire,
right?
Because there was, compared to other times at least, there was relative peace in the Middle East and across the Ottoman Empire, right? And basically, if you paid your taxes and you responded with essentially a draft. If they needed military and you sent people to fight in a war if they needed it for protection and you paid your taxes, you could live your life and do what you wanted to do.
Right.
That was the Ottoman Empire, right? And they did a fairly good job of that. They also sometimes ruled with an iron fist, right? It went both ways a little bit. But then when we pulled that apart and made all these promises that we were going to, the UK and France really, right? Because they're really the ones who divvied up the Ottoman Empire, right? You're going to control Palestine, you're going to do this. I mean, in fact, it's later, I think the UK was controlling the Levant, right? And Syria, Jordan, I believe, were France. And anyway,
they divided up Palestine, Iraq, Iran.
That's right. And eventually, though, they said, "You know what? We're done with it." And the UK gave it to the United Nations and said, "Do something with it." Their hands were out of it right at that point. And they didn't follow through on that. And I feel like, because we mentioned Vietnam.
Well, it would actually be Wilson's League of Nations too, which
exactly
we were worried about other things and didn't even join.
But Wilson wanted the League of Nations, and our own Congress wouldn't even allow us to join
it. Do it because of the way that things were headed.
Yeah, but he had that much of an impact on that.
If you go back and you look at that stuff, there's a lot of the British Empire had a lot of fault in some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were a giant empire too,
right? And
then after World War I, they're governing these other places who now want independence from them.
Right.
The British Empire was ginormous, and they wanted control over some of the Ottoman Empire because of India.
Not completely justly handled either. That's the thing.
Well, look at India.
We tend to look at the British as the white knights, but at the end of the day, sometimes they're not.
Yeah. I mean, if now they had a border between India and whatever was going to become of the Middle East to protect their own interests there, right? Now, I think as a nation, you should look out for your own people and your own interests.
Even the settling of World War II sort of went that way, with the British Empire and the way we divvied up Germany and some things like that.
Yeah, but it also teed up lots of problems for the world, which still exist now. We in a previous episode we were talking about the Satanic Panic and the aftermath of that, and sort of the ripples left in the water that still affect us. And the ripples left in the water from World War I, World War II, I don't even know that they're ripples.
No.
They're tsunamis.
Yeah, they create
that
the
are
Cold War.
Exactly. You create the Cold War. You have all these.
This is another topic.
Exactly. You have all these problems that are pervading the world, and war still existing to this day. And so, a loving war, right? A just war, at least from the Christian standpoint, the way it stands in philosophical history, is that it's motivated by love. And that you want it to end quickly too, like you bring it to a timely resolution.
It has to have a resolution as a key term here.
Yeah, and so
A positive resolution.
Vietnam, right? If you're gonna, or any war really, if you're gonna start it, you need to finish
You
the
need to finish
thing.
it. So
You leave things
Afghanistan
undone.
is looking even worse in that respect.
Yeah, well, exactly. So in the modern era, we've done the same thing. We say we're going to do this thing. We get in there, we start doing it, and say, I don't know if I have the stomach for it.
Right.
And then you pull out, and now you're left with
We left catastrophe behind.
exactly this chaos. Is that loving? No.
No.
It doesn't matter what the intention was in the beginning.
Right.
You could have said this is motivated out of love to go into Afghanistan. But when you leave without it being finished, you caused more problems than maybe there were to begin with.
Some of that though, were sucker punched in the eye September 11th, if you will.
Sure.
Some of that's not going to be loving because it's going to be retaliatory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a little bit of that is there.
Yeah.
With that, now trying to help Afghanis establish a stable government, it's a pretty loving thing.
Yes.
But it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, even the Soviets had a difficulty in that department.
Well, and that dovetails into what we just said a minute ago. Like the Ottoman Empire, it's a dictator. I mean, well, it had a king, and so if you take that and now you say, you know what, you people, this doesn't work this way anymore. You're no longer an empire. There's no king. You're gonna have elections. There's gonna be democracy. We're gonna change the way that you live your life.
Right.
Undo everything. The Ottoman Empire controlled that area for 400 years.
And I thought about that. When we talked about this in the past together.
Yeah.
We talked about the Kurds in Iraq.
They weren't given their own nation.
But what I didn't think of was at the end of World War I, the Turks themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Armenian genocide.
That's right.
So it's a good example,
which is still denied.
That's
by them.
not handled properly.
Yeah.
It's a result of World War I not resolving properly.
Yeah.
And then, at the end of the day, if you look at World War I, it'd be hard to call it a just war.
Yeah. Because if you don't finish, like if the motivation again is, no matter what it is, if it's love to get in,
yeah.
And when you're talking about finishing it properly,
well, there's already your agreements, right? The alliance system.
That's right.
That drags you into it.
But now, do you have to retaliate in the end of it, right?
Right.
That's the part I think that tees up World War II.
Right.
Because
when putting the blame on one scapegoat in that situation is what causes the next war.
That's right.
So it's hard to say that hardly any of World War I is justified.
So do you think that any of these times that we've, no matter what nation it's been, at the end of the war, when there's reparations to be paid,
pretty justifiable.
When there's reparations to be paid, though, and when you do it specifically to retaliate, to teach a lesson, so to speak,
right?
Do you think that is the loving thing to do at the end of the war?
No.
So how do you resolve then? You think something like World War I? I think about us in World War II.
Nuremberg's a better example.
Okay, go ahead.
They are still putting people on trial for the war,
mm-hmm.
but at the end result, you're targeting people who did actually commit war crimes
instead of the general population.
Instead of the people of Germany were handled, I would say, with a little bit of respect and a little bit of dignity,
mm-hmm.
whereas in World War I they weren't. They were blamed solely for the war, which they didn't even start. If we really want to get to the bottom,
economic and financial hardships like runaway inflation,
right.
shortages of food.
Well, that has to do with the blockade, of course, which they were kind of egging on because of the submarine warfare. But at the end of the day,
They wanted to get out from under
they
the
didn't
thumb
start
of
the war. They only participated in it. I mean, if you think about who starts it, it's really the Allied side that fires a shot. I mean, the Serbians are on the side of the Allies.
well, yeah, sure.
But you can understand where they're coming from, too. So it's kind of a hard...
It's
hard
such
thing
a tangled web, man, when you go to war. So that's why I think I don't know that we give it enough thought. I know that, maybe people are going to say, well, something happens, you have to respond. And I get that there has to be a response.
Washington warned us to stay out of foreign entanglements.
Yeah.
If we don't get into the kind of defensive treaty that forces us to fight, and we lend our aid when we think it's just, I think that's fair.
That makes more sense.
Right.
And I think from a Christian perspective, that makes more sense too.
Right.
So, we shouldn't start a war simply because our economy isn't good.
Right.
Or
that
we just want something better.
The battle of ideas between the two economies.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that fit in? Because clearly communism, if it were the pure form that's on paper,
if it worked,
would be a good thing.
Yeah.
But because of man's sinfulness, you're always going to have a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Should we oppose dictatorships? I think yes. I think we should. But at the end of all of that, sure, you topple this dictator, but then what?
Yeah, what comes after that?
That's right.
And I think you have to think about that, right? Am I going to go from bad to worse?
Right.
In this area, just because I took this person out, is it now going to be better?
Well, and you have to
look at Iran.
That's a good example. But you have Afghanistan and Iraq. Right? Mm-hmm. They're polar opposites. Afghanistan, we pulled out too soon.
Yeah.
Let it fall. But Iraq seemed to be pretty stable.
Yeah.
And we did we did topple the dictator there.
Right.
Actually, we allowed the people themselves to take care of it.
That's right.
So, in a way, you have some justifiable things, but to say the whole war is justifiable.
Well, I don't think you're ever going to get there because we get too emotionally wrapped up in it,
right.
And we make rash decisions,
yep.
And we do things that are inherently human,
right.
Which cause us to do things we shouldn't do, to take actions we shouldn't take, and all. But I was thinking about wrapping it up correctly. If you think about World War II, U.S. Japan. We helped rebuild that nation.
Done with some dignity.
That's right.
The emperor was not charged with the crime. That's a big deal.
That's so we didn't just try to. We say, okay, now that you're down, I'm gonna poke you in the eye.
Right.
That is not what we did.
Right.
We helped them to rebuild. We funded it. I mean,
if you look at that,
MacArthur sits there for 10 years.
The two greatest economies on the planet today, barring China, of course.
Sure.
You have Japan, and you have the western part of Germany, if you will.
Yeah.
So,
but yeah, Japan. I mean, they are like leaders in tech and several different industries, and it's a small place in the world. But we helped them to put them back together, and we're
with a parliamentary democracy.
That's right, and we're friendly with them, even though they were definitely an empire before,
no doubt.
But we helped to make that happen. I think that was an appropriate kind of loving end to that battle, to that war.
Right.
We wrapped it up, put a bow on it, and we didn't stop until it was done.
Now, the dropping of the bomb comes into question.
That is a different question.
But when you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue with.
It is, but again, that would have to go back to the idea of is it a more loving thing to do?
That comes into the trolley problem.
Yeah, but also who was really in charge of making those decisions, right? Because the president doesn't even know that it happened until way after the fact.
Well, Truman does. Truman says, "Yeah, do it."
He says to do it.
Yeah,
but they're waiting on a window, right? And then it actually happens. And he doesn't even know it happened yet.
Right.
Like, it takes time to get that information back.
Right.
And then he's thinking, well, maybe we ought to slow this thing down, right? And he's sending a letter, stop, drop, and
Yeah.
nuclear weapons, right? And we'd already dropped the second one, and then you got people like Curtis LeMay, who he's still leading firebombing runs.
Well, the truth be told, is we really
after both bombs.
We didn't have but maybe one more. I mean, after that,
I agree, but LeMay is like, he is firebombing cities
right
after both bombs, and in fact, even after the treaty is signed, he is still doing it.
Right.
And they finally like, it's over, man.
You're done, bro.
You're done. Yeah, slow down. And so, you have people like Curtis LeMay, and if you read about him, you understand him, and he becomes head of Strategic Air Command, right? And he's an important figure. He's instrumental in understanding the air battle of World War II and in the Pacific and how that happened. But
I think if you look at MacArthur and Korea, even, you've got a battle of ideas there between him and Truman ends up firing him. But his solution was to nuke China, which that's nothing loving in that.
So knowing what we know,
but it's the same man who rebuilt Japan. So the irony is that he does know how.
Sure,
he
does know how to do it.
Right.
But whether he wants to continue to do it or not is something else. So that leads to another issue, like nuclear weapons, right? So what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's lots of ethical and moral questions about it, and we're not going to resolve that today. But those bombs are quite small compared to what we developed shortly later after World War II in the 50s.
To my knowledge, we've never used thermonuclear on a population.
Not on a population, but we did blow them up plenty.
Oh, yeah.
So, Bikini Atoll first, and then we move it to the U.S. So in the 50s, Bikini Atoll, right, we're blowing up nuclear weapons that were 1,000 times stronger than what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
1,000 times. And if you see the images of that, is it ever going to be a loving thing to drop that on someone? And do we need thousands of them?
Well, then you get into the whole mutually assured destruction.
You do, right, with Russia.
You have that many
Soviet
as
Union
a
and then
threat
Russia.
to prevent the idea of that ever happening.
Sure.
It's sort of a mad deterrent.
It is, but they move it to the U.S. and then what was funny, I was looking recently at one of the worst movies. Well, it is the worst movie that John Wayne ever made, called The Conqueror. He plays Genghis Khan,
right?
And it's filmed out in Arizona, okay, and it's miles away from the nuclear testing range. And they're blowing up these weapons that are 1,000 times stronger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He assures the people, the other actors and actresses and the extras and all the rest, that it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Dozens of people die of cancer from radiation on that movie set.
Wow.
And John Wayne himself gets lung cancer right after, and they weren't sure whether it was smoking or whether it was the nuclear weapon. Yeah, but we know for sure many of them it was the effects of the radiation.
There's a question that the cancer that is prevalent today is affected by, of course, bikini tests.
Stuff that we dropped at Bikini Atoll. If you grow a tomato in your backyard and it gets rainwater,
right,
there's going to be radiation in that tomato that we can tie directly to those particular weapons.
The thing about coming into a situation where you have another Hiroshima. See, that decision was it was
really a military decision.
You do or you don't, right? Based on
not Truman in
numbers and there's all sorts of factors in that. What are the chances we would ever come to that again, that we would need to use nuclear weapons? That's nigh impossible. I mean, that was a very specific circumstance where I don't know that we ever cross that bridge again.
It makes me wonder, we'll have to do this in another topic, dealing with the Cold War, because of like dead man switches and things like that with the U.S. and Russia, and what happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and
you think about the power that a U.S. Navy submarine skipper has.
Yeah, where you can just do it, and that's something, because we all have the idea, I think, in our head that nuclear weapons, that there's this electronic device that has to be activated and hold the button and turn the key and all that, but that's not true. that is not how it's all held, right?
I have been in a decommissioned silo, and it is, here's one key, and the other one's on the other side by your door.
If you have multiple people to agree on this thing.
It's a definite requirement of more than one.
That's right.
And as I understand it, in Russia, they have even greater scrutiny on that.
Well, I think they did because they had some close calls,
Right.
again, which we'll talk about again. Because the whole dead man switch thing, whether that was real or not.
I think the big problem with nuclear weapons is somebody else getting a hold of them.
Sure. Somebody who's...
Your major superpowers have had them and haven't used them, but you have some wild country out there.
I don't know even that we could say... I think that we're using them without using them.
Right.
Right?
As a threat.
Yes, that's
like
right.
holding a gun.
It's intimidation. It's,
Which is
all
not
that.
loving.
No. So I don't... if we think about the number of wars that have taken place that the U.S. has participated in, some of them, again, I can see...
It's a lot for a democracy when you think about it.
Yeah.
It is. It's a lot.
I can see their involvement as being a loving thing. And then in other times, I don't know about that,
How many of them have ties to commerce?
Exactly. Whether it's oil or some other thing,
Or even with the War of 1812, where, yes, sure, they are doing some things that are violations, but it's mostly maritime commerce.
Yeah. Well, even our involvement in Central America and things that we did there, which some of these things that we do aren't technically war, right? Because they're not declared by Congress, but they're acts of war, essentially.
Teddy called it big stick diplomacy.
Yeah.
And then Wilson comes right behind him and changes it to missionary diplomacy, where we're spreading U.S.
Spreading
foreign policy,
democracy and foreign policy. Yeah.
I don't think that's really, as Christians, I don't think that's
some
really,
of that's just talking points, though, right? It means nothing. It
we're
has
supposed to be spreading the gospel regardless of ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, for centuries and centuries, people lived under dictatorships. They lived under the rule of kings and queens.
Right.
You think of the Holy Roman Empire. There were certainly Christians
So
throughout the Holy Roman Empire.
kind of where I'd like to spin this is, this question pops up on an individual level for a soldier.
Yeah.
Where
Like conscientious objectors.
exactly, or even like,
Not registered for the draft.
a
Or
My
something.
Lai incident case.
I see.
Where at what point is your actions in the war justifiable? You're a soldier, your job is to kill people.
Yeah.
And the scripture clearly says thou shalt not, murder.
Yeah.
So, when is a soldier justified in his job? That's kind of where, if his country is unjust, does that make him unjust?
Well, I think that's how we would have looked at German soldiers that way. With the end of World War II.
But we do separate out SS from Wehrmacht.
Sure.
And the Wehrmacht is handled with a little bit less heavy-handedness, and I think we have to look at it that way a little bit, because look at the Civil War. People are not fighting over the big issues; they're fighting for their land, their
own livelihood,
their life,
or some of them, especially in the South, fighting. They're fighting because someone paid them to do it,
right? Because the rich are
big
not
landowner.
fighting. It's been said it's a poor man's war. It's a rich man's fight, but a poor man's war.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, because the wealthy people, they're not going to go out to risk their own lives.
Right.
I'll send someone in my stead. In fact, I'll send many in my stead.
With the slave owners, that's kind of the big point. I mean, that's
Yeah.
Clearly, that's not justified what they're doing. Right?
So to go back to the Revolutionary War for a moment, you think that our skirmish with them, that there had been enough,
like Jefferson puts
diplomacy,
it, when a long train of abuses and usurpations have, been present, then it's the right of the people to rise up and alter or abolish the government. And that's literally what we did. So,
what's funny about that too is that, King George was looked at so differently across the pond than he was here, right? Because he was well liked.
Well, and I don't necessarily think that your British soldiers in that fight are unjust. They're trying to preserve their colony. It's just
it's essentially though a rebellion against that form of government from that distance.
Right.
That's the way you're saying.
It's literally what it is, and it ends up being a result of they really couldn't find another way to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So we fight about it.
Yeah, because when we think about things like taxation without representation, I think today we still have that problem, no matter what kind of government we have, because you can elect your representative and have a majority of people that agree with you, but still have one person in Congress on some committee who can stop something from moving forward.
So now we're moving into our argument for term limits.
Well, yeah, because once you rise up to that point, you've ceased to become a representative of the people.
Right.
Now you're a representative of an established government,
right.
And you're preserving your power rather than our power,
right.
and so is that really?
Well, that's the disturbing thing about our politics today is you have politicians who are in there for the people, but you have quite a few that are in it for getting elected the next time.
Yeah.
And so the things that they do are motivated by that, not by
it has to always be there, right?
Intent, right?
What about so you think though, as far as term limits are concerned, terms of U.S. congressmen, senators, presidents, if the longer term or a shorter term is that better? Because if you're getting elected every 2 years, it's almost like you have to immediately start campaigning to thinking about your next time.
True.
Or is it 4 years or 6 years?
As
right?
a representative may be a little short, but not to get into politics, but I do have an idea of how term limits can work.
Yeah.
Where you give a representative something like five opportunities, would give them 10 years in office.
Yeah.
And then you give a senator 2, they'd have 12 years in office. The president already is limited to 10. A lot of people don't realize that.
That's right, because you can assume the office as vice president.
As long as it was only 2 years, you can run twice.
That's right.
So a total of 10 years. And so you would put everybody at that 10-year point, and I think that would cause people to run for the reason of being a civic-minded individual rather than running to get the pension and running to get the popularity.
You're set for life. You're set for life in there anyway. It's crazy.
Right.
It's so different than it was in the beginning. So I think that we slowly migrated our way away from
war. Talking about war?
No, but we have done that too.
Yeah.
But migrated our way from in the beginning of this nation for people who weren't even paid.
Right.
To now their future is secure forever.
Right.
Because they won
at some
an
point
election.
It stopped being a civic duty and it became a career.
Yeah.
And not just a career, but one that would be very lucrative.
That's right.
And not just lucrative in financial ways, but lucrative in power and opportunity, influence.
Well, because you have the power to influence the next generation and what your children are going to do and your grandchildren are going to do, your cousin and your brother.
Even if we limited terms, the influence wouldn't go away.
Right.
Because you'd still have that power.
That's right.
I mean, look.
Well, that's why I was thinking, if a short term, if you have a longer term, you sort of have time to get into office, to do the things that you think need to be done, and ride that out for a while and hope that you'll still get elected on the other end. You see what I'm saying? Because we have kind of a short-term memory when it comes to political issues.
Right.
It goes away. 2 years, though, I mean, people are running 18 months out.
Right.
So they're in there for 6 months. They have to start running for office
you
again.
Think about something like, and I'm going to mention a name here because he's long dead, but J. Strom Thurmond from Alabama.
Yeah.
He's in the Senate at 102 with an oxygen tank.
Not participating,
and he's
not doing
who was
anything.
Involved on the opposite side of the civil rights movement. If you go back far enough,
That's right. Yeah,
that's an argument for term limits.
Yeah. I mean, there's a time to move out of the way and allow the next generation to run the place, because that's who's alive, right? If it's a government of the people, right,
for the people and by
the people, then that is what it should be.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel that way about the presidency too, because everybody's, nothing against people who are 80 years old, but at some point you are in the minority of
the opinion.
You're the minority opinion no matter what. Because of your age, because you're disconnected from the next generations,
And it's not that I think we should put that, but now there's a whole other thing is we already have term limits on the president, but we've almost made it to where it has to be from one or the other party.
Yeah.
The
whole party thing, man, from the beginning, that was
Washington said it.
He did. Idea. He said a lot of things that were bad ideas that came to pass.
Fell right into.
Yeah.
That's right.
But so war then, right?
Well, to quote Washington, the Neutrality Proclamation is where we're going to stay out of those things.
Yeah.
And then at some point we realized that you cannot completely stay out of those things because we're part of the world.
There has to be some involvement in some way.
That's right.
Because the world is smaller than it seems.
Right.
So, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but just to say, what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. There are foreign policy decisions being made, and obviously different opinions on that matter, but that affects the entire world. It doesn't just affect Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, it affects everybody.
It affects everybody, especially Europe.
And
if it affects Europe, then it's affecting many of our allies.
You almost have a David and Goliath right there, too.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of a focal point for that reason as well.
Yeah, and then the Israeli-Hamas war, same kinds of things happening because you have...
well, that goes back to the mishandling of World War I.
It does, and so our involvement created that problem. When you have the Ottoman Empire ruling the place for 400 years without an issue, there are Jews, Christians, and Muslims all living there. They're all living in the Gaza Strip. They're all living around Jerusalem. Life is life, right? 400 years.
Right.
And then we dismantle it because we know better.
Right. I think you go back and look at something like Islamic Spain. Look at Cordoba and the learning that takes place there. And
Yeah.
you Muslims, Christians, and Jews present. And the interesting thing about that is that's probably the most we've been able to work together since.
Well, because we wouldn't have had a 9/11.
Right.
You wouldn't have had Desert Storm.
Right.
You wouldn't have had Desert Shield. You wouldn't have had the Second Gulf War. It erases all of that.
Right.
The decisions that were made at that time, that ripple effect.
Potentially
did all of
erasing World War II because if
Yeah.
World War I was the war to end all wars that was supposed to be,
That's right.
then
If you wouldn't have had the reparations put on Germany like it was, Germany would not have done what they did
that's right.
in World War II.
They would have gone through a Great Depression just like the rest of us, but it would not have resulted in a fascist dictatorship and the sort of thing that ended up happening.
Because I think what people don't realize is that they think it's only in one direction that you end up in trouble, and it's just not true.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether it's from the left or from the right. You end up in the same place, but you have a different foundation for it, right? You go too far left, you end up with a dictatorship.
You go too far right,
You go too far right, you end up in a dictatorship.
Right.
The rules are different, and how you got there is different, but the end result,
Who benefits is different.
That's right. Who benefits is different, but it's essentially the same thing. And almost in both cases, you end up with a very elite ruling class in some way, and you end up with people who foot the bill for them and for the leaders. So at that point, you might as well be a monarchy, because that's what it looks like again.
Yep. And I think to steer it back towards our aim of talking about it with Christianity, because we kind of got in the weeds of the politics for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
You have to. And I think that kind of goes into Christians being involved in politics.
Yeah.
You have to.
That's right. You have to be involved, and you do. And I think Christians are responsible to educate themselves on.
We should know our history.
We should, especially history, because we don't realize that we go through the same motions, and I heard before that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot.
That's a good way to put it.
But it does. It's like the same things over and over and over, and we are doomed to repeat it, right? This rhyming thing continues to happen because we're not engaged in the way that we should be. We choose a side and we rally together and we move ahead, and we think that's the just thing to do. That's the right thing to do, but that may not be
Well,
it.
and then there's a faction that always is Christians shouldn't be involved with politics. We should steer clear of that sort of thing.
Sure,
And I think that's the wrong motivation, because if we don't take a role, it's going to
affect you either way, right? But I think in those cases, people in those positions would say that no matter what the government does, God is who He is. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and it doesn't matter.
God's will be done.
Yeah.
There's no way around that.
So I think they're still okay from their theological standpoint. Now, I think that we should take a more active role in those things, and
Christian politicians should not be a joke.
Well, yeah, that's right. If we were, like we said earlier, no matter why World War I starts, if we're going to be so involved as we were as a nation, if we had that Christian underpinning in there of doing the things the right way, you don't end up with all of these other wars after.
Right.
You know how many lives that saves? It's a loving thing to do it correctly.
Between Wilson's 14 points, and if they actually implemented all of them, how different that would be.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, that does sort of come from a Christian perspective.
It does. From a particular mindset of Christianity, like we were talking about in a previous episode.
I mean, obviously, everybody's got their vices and things.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that someone like Wilson's a Christian president, that would be overstepping.
Yeah.
But his 14 points certainly come from the angle of trying to make things work.
But see, Wilson and Congress couldn't even agree on the way they were going to work this thing out. And that's sad.
Well, and he had the stroke, and then Edith was basically running things.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that.
So if we could have again ended that appropriately, no matter the cost. So if you find yourself in war, no matter why it started, whether it was loving or not, if we create a loving end to it, to do it in that way, has an impact that's enormous. Because at the end of World War I, you're not thinking about 9/11 in the future. You're not thinking about all these Middle East wars.
Right.
You don't know all this is going to happen.
Well, and then all of those trigger each other too.
They all do.
So you don't have September 11th.
One plays right into the other over and over again. And so war is a bad idea.
And in a way,
but if you're going to do it, you need to end it in an appropriate way.
To go back further, in a way, this ties into the Crusades.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we hadn't had Christians that were saying that God wills it, that we go and take the Holy Land.
Sure. Yeah. Deus vult.
All of these
God
things,
wills it.
That clearly was not a just idea.
No. No. And that leads to, to things they say like this new movement, if you will, or new growth of a movement, Christian nationalism, right? Of taking over and becoming a huge part of Congress, because there are a number of people that are in Congress now that make the claim that they are Christian nationalists, and it's not, and they wear it as a badge of honor.
I think the church is the sleeping giant in the vote. I think we do have to say
it is. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is, are we blindly accepting some people because they claim to be who we are? And that, I think, is the danger.
Just because you say the right things doesn't make you God's man for the job.
That's right. And so it depends who's there, and depends who's in our Congress. Folks, the Congress
it doesn't have to be man for the job either.
That's right. So these men and women who are in Congress, they are the ones who make the decisions about war. Do you declare war or not declare war? And who are you declaring war against? And how is this going to be tied and wrapped up? They're involved with the treaties. They're involved with all these different things, and those are the people that we are electing. So are we electing people? So our job then as individuals, right? If we elect people that are competent for that task, because it's so important, right? What happens with war and how it ends. We just demonstrated because of World War I.
Right.
If we fix that problem and we get that straightened out, right, and we have the right people in place, then the right outcome happens, and we've done our part in that because we were diligent and because we knew that was supposed to be the way it was going to go, and we wanted them to be loving, and we were instructive about that, and we're teaching it in our churches and in our homes, and how to love one another. Jesus tells us that as these greatest commandments, and that plays in all the way into war and in everything that we do in our lives.
Right.
And if we work that out in that way, as Jesus said, you seek the kingdom first, and all these things will be added unto you. Instead, we get it worked up in war, and we want reparations, and we want people to pay for this and to pay for that, and we seek retaliation instead of an end.
Well, and generation,
and we end up in chaos.
Reparations wise, at what point do you say that the people that are alive today owe the reparations for the war that happened 100 years ago?
Right.
And going back on that, Great Britain and France fought a war that lasted for more than 100 years. They forgot the reason they were fighting.
Right. Yeah, by the end of it, they didn't even know.
If you're going to go into a
all
fight,
I know is we're enemies.
the reason needs to be clear.
Yeah.
And it needs to be...
And focus. You have to have an end designed from the beginning. You don't just start the war and say, we'll figure out why we're here later.
Right.
You have to know what the end goal is.
It can't be vague.
That's right.
That's right.
It needs to be specific. And that's the only way that you have a good end.
Right.
Whatever that end is, it just needs to be very specific.
Yeah, I think if you're comparing like Afghanistan to Vietnam, I think we did have a specific goal in Vietnam. I just think that not everybody was on the same page with that goal.
They weren't. Right? I mean, when Congress isn't funding it anymore, when they're left with no fuel, and
Right.
All these things are happening. The military has a different point of view than.
Well, even the South Vietnamese have a different opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
And ideally, their opinion is the one that should matter because
we're in their nation.
It's their country that's trying to solve
That's
the
right.
problem.
That's right. So, anyway, at the end of the day, then, right, war should be motivated by love. We should have a clear goal, a stated clear goal. We know what that is. And once we get that, we want to bring everything to a swift end, and to do so in a way that restores as well as possible, and mends broken relationships and lifts everybody up. That is the whole purpose of war, and that's what we should be doing.
And I think even national level and at an individual level, as an individual, you're following the orders that you're given.
That's right.
I think you're still motivated by love.
Mm-hmm.
Your aim in the war should be to...
Well, if our leaders are making these clear statements,
Right.
like, this is the goal, you know why you're there.
Right.
You're not standing there saying, I don't even understand why we're here in this war at all. If that's what's happening, it's already wrong.
Right.
We should know, right? We should know. So, anyway, good conversation. We're going to pick up another one soon. We'll think about it. We've got lots of topics that would like to discuss. I think will be interesting random conversations. These are the kind of random conversations that we have weekly anyway. So we're just going to put them in podcast form so you guys get to hear it. And we hope you enjoy it. See you guys next time.